This video addresses God's knowledge and free will in Protestant Christianity. The issue for Protestant Christianity is no different than it is for Judaism or for Catholic Christianity. That is, if God knows all things, if He's omniscient, then He also knows the future. If He knows the future, then the future is determined. And if the future is determined, then it seems that humans can't be free actors, but rather their actions are already fixed, because God knows the future. So the question then relates to the compatibility of God's knowledge of all things and human free will. The discussion of the compatibility of these two things is an especially prominent one in the history of Protestant Christianity. However, it isn't itself an issue that was key to the origins of Protestant Christianity. That is, the Reformation was not fundamentally about these issues. Rather, it became an issue, although relatively early on. For Protestant Christians, the discussion of God's knowledge and free will is closely bound up, one, with the human problem, which is, in its basic contours, the same as it is for the Catholic Church, but it differs from Judaism. Okay? It's also closely bound up with salvation, hence the significance of the issue. For Protestant Christians, as for Jews and Catholic Christians, there's a basic consensus on two issues. On the one hand, God knows all things, including the future, and on the other hand, humans have free will. Okay? And of course, the issue is, how are these two compatible? Okay? An important distinction here, especially for Protestant Christians, is whether humans are free to choose salvation or not. Okay? That is, what type of freedom are we talking about? Is it freedom for all things or just some things? And this is where the lines of the debate, if you will, have been drawn among Protestant Christians. Among Protestants, there are two basic camps, we'll call them. This is, if you will, an oversimplification, but these are two basic camps that most Protestant Christians would identify as one or the other, or if they don't, they would say, I'm kind of a bit of each of these. That is, these are the categories that people are usually talking about. These two are Calvinism on the one hand and Arminianism on the other. Both of these derive their names from their founders, John Calvin and Jacob Arminius. And historically, if you look at the dates of these two persons, you can see that John Calvin predates Jacob Arminius. And so Calvinism, if you will, predates Arminianism, and Arminianism is in some ways a response to Calvinism. It's important to distinguish the teachings of the founders from their traditions. That is, John Calvin doesn't hold to all of Calvinism, and the same for Jacobus Arminius. Okay. What we're focusing on today is Calvinism and Arminianism, not the teachings of their founders. Okay, so first, Calvinism. According to Calvinism, humans have free will. However, free will is defined specifically as acting according to one's desires. That is, whereas I may have free will to choose to pursue wealth by either of two options, I'm not free to change my desire to have wealth. That is, my desires are fixed, but I can freely act on those desires. Accordingly, human free will is limited by our desires. And for Calvinism, then, the role of predestination is that God chooses to or chooses not to change the desires of some people. Calvinism holds to the idea of double predestination. This is the idea that God chooses some people to be saved and some people to be condemned. There are 5 points of Calvinism that are meant to encapsulate what Calvinism is, and 2 of these, at least, are the 2 listed at the bottom of the screen under Tulip. And these relate directly to our topics of human free will. Okay. These are the teachings of unconditional election and irresistible grace. According to Calvinism, God's choice of some to be saved and some to be condemned is unconditional. That is, it's not based on whether people do well or do poorly, or do right or do wrong. Rather, it's simply because God chooses. He chooses people unconditionally. Okay. A related point, also part of this acronym TULIP, is irresistible grace. That is, when God chooses somebody, they can't resist. So, in the Calvinist worldview, you have many humans, all of whom have free will, at least to the extent that they are acting freely, but within the context of what their desires are. Some of those who have been chosen by God, have had their desires, if you will, changed, and therefore they are also free to pursue the desires of God, something like that. Okay. The other part of humanity are bound by evil desires, or the desires that are not those of God's, and so they're free, but only to pursue the desires that they have, which are determined and are fallen, according to the doctrine of total depravity. The Arminianist position differs at a few points. It agrees with the Calvinist position that all people are depraved, that is, they are sinful beyond their own repair. They can't pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. However, Arminianism has a doctrine of prevenient grace, okay? And this prevenient grace has been given to all people prior to their accepting or not accepting of God. Okay? And this prevenient grace allows the totally depraved person to be regenerated at least enough so that they're able to choose or not to choose God. The function of this type of grace, according to the Arminianists, is that humans now have free will after God has given them this initial grace, this prevenient grace, to choose or not to choose God. And so humans then are free both to act according to their desires and to change their desires, at least including the desire to accept God and His saving grace, or not to accept it. Okay. So, accordingly then, God doesn't predestine some people for salvation and some people for condemnation, but rather He has let all people freely choose. Those are some of the basic contours of the 2 main camps within Protestant Christianity. What I'd like to do now is look at some more distinctions that are helpful in teasing out whether human free will and God's foreknowledge are compatible. As you may have felt during our brief little summary of Calvinism and Arminianism, the two positions themselves don't actually attempt to address the compatibility of human free will and God's foreknowledge. Rather, they just assume it and deal with other aspects of it. Yet that's how the discussion is generally framed. Okay. What I have here is simply a number of basic distinctions that are part of the conversation among Protestant Christians about how to relate these two. Okay, let's start on the left side of the screen in the box with the 2 points, hard determinism and soft determinism. This is a distinction that is sometimes made simply to more narrowly define what is meant by determinism, or the idea that God determines what is going to happen. Hard determinism simply states that all is causally determined. In a causally determined system, it seems at least, that humans don't have, or there isn't space for human free will. Soft determinism, on the other hand, claims that some types of free actions are possible in a causally determined system. That is, the extent to which all things are determined, the big picture, is all set, but just below that, there is a level of free will which operates within these more general strictures, determining the course of history and these sorts of things. One more distinction that is we'll call it a sub-distinction of soft determinism, is between two types of necessity. The first is a more general understanding of necessity, where an act is necessary if it must occur. So if God foresees the future and he says such and such is going to happen, it's necessary, it must occur, it's going to happen. The second type of necessity is defined as acting according to one's internal nature. Acting according to one's internal nature. This is closely related to Calvin's idea that humans have free will according to their desires, but they don't have free will to change their desires. That is, they have an internal nature which is set, and they necessarily act in a certain way after that. So that's another distinction. Many would reject the type of necessity which is termed number 2 here. That is, as not necessary for a soft determinist understanding of the relationship between God's foreknowledge and human free will. Another distinction that is helpful relates to God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty is closely related to his predestination of things. He's sovereign, he has rule over everything, he determines these things. Okay. Specific sovereignty is the idea that God has specific purposes for everything that occurs. Okay. That is, down to the smallest minutiae, everything happens a specific way, and God has a purpose for this. This is, on a popular level, we can see this when a person reflects on experiences they've had, and on the assumption that everything happens for a specific purpose, they're able to then pick out how God is working in all of these specific circumstances, or make assumptions about this. Okay. General sovereignty would limit the extent to which God's specific purposes influence the minutiae of daily life. That is, some things have specific purposes, but on a more detailed level, God doesn't have specific purposes for these things. Okay. Finally, one last distinction, which might be helpful for reconciling these two, is simply the distinction between a temporal perspective and an atemporal perspective. One way forward with this is to make the observation that God's omniscience, his knowledge of all things, is an atemporal statement. That is, it's a timeless statement about God's nature, right? And then to follow this up by saying that God's foreknowledge only implies determinism when viewed from a temporal perspective. That is, as humans, we believe that God has foreknowledge, and from our perspective, where there is a future, God's foreknowledge of things seems to mean that they've all been determined, and our human actions can't change any of these things. However, that's only because we're bound by temporality. That doesn't mean we can simply make sense of things and see how these two are reconcilable, but simply it provides perspective about human limitedness based on their location within time, and suggests that if we could get outside of time, God's knowledge of all things and human free will are completely compatible. And so what this idea does is it identifies the location of the seeming tension here in humans' perspectivalness. Now, interestingly, these last three distinctions are not distinctions limited to Protestant discussions of the compatibility of these two things, human free will and God's foreknowledge. However, the impetus for a lot of this discussion has been from Protestants, and so we include it in the Protestant perspectives.